I call Raymond Ho.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before my contribution, I'd like to thank National MP Mr. Paul Quinn for introducing his members' bill, because despite the fact that we're wasting valuable time of the House debating this silly bill, however, Mr. Paul Quinn, by presenting this bill, shows clearly what his government is up to. That way, the whole country may have saved a lot of, a considerable amount of time, because the government veil of the political correctness has been lifted. This bill is designed to look as though national are tough on crime, but the reality is, through this bill and a subsequent amendment recommended by his National and Act members of the Law and Order Select Committee, this bill will allow all existing prisoners, including New Zealand's worst criminals like Graham Burton and William Bell, to vote. The only winners, should this bill pass into law, seem to be Graham Burton, William Bell and Clayton Weatherston, who are not permitted to vote under the current law. Mr. Chairman, Graham Burton and co. can't vote. The very worst criminals are already disqualified from registering as electors under the current law. As a member of the Law and Order Select Committee, I am amazed to see that the National and Act members, being the majority of the Select Committee, recommended amending the title of the bill and subsequently sections 4 and 5. Mr. Paul Quinn mentioned about his SOP, which has just reinforced my position. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Parliamentary Council Office for doing a great job, because they are professionals and they're not responsible for any policy initiatives. And so it's not fair to try to blame them for any mistakes originated from the policy initiatives. By recommending completely repealing the current disqualification provision in the Electoral Act 1993, sections 81 sub 1 sub D, and replacing it with the new provision, and I read it out, a person who is detained in a prison pursuant to a sentence of imprisonment imposed after the commencement of the electoral disqualification of sentenced prisoners Amendment Act 2010. It removed the legislative provision that disqualifies people presently serving lengthy prison sentences, and instead only disqualifies people sentenced to prison after the bill is enacted into law. So there would be nothing in law to stop anyone imprisoned at the time the bill is enacted from applying to be registered to vote and consequently casting a vote at the 2011 general election. That includes our worst murderers, rapists and violent criminals like Graham Burton, William Bell and Clayton Weatherston, who are not permitted to vote under the current law. I don't agree to the Department of Corrections' view that the disqualification would continue to apply to presently disqualified prisoners by virtue of the Act's Interpretation Act 1999. Section 19 sub 1 states that the repeal of an enactment does not affect a liability to a penalty for an offence or for breach of an enactment committed before the repeal. The problem is, Mr. Chair, disqualification from voting is not itself a penalty. It's a consequence of a penalty being imposed. Under the Electoral Act 1993, all adult New Zealanders and permanent residents are eligible to be enrolled. Section 80 then disqualifies some of those people, but by removing the clause and Section 80 that disqualifies prisoners serving 3 years imprisonment or more, the people must become eligible to be enrolled. I do agree, however, to the Attorney General that this bill is constitutionally flawed and is unjustifiable inconsistent, Mr. Chair, with the electoral rights affirmed by Section 12.
Chairman, I want to try and focus in on who's covered and who's not covered by this legislation. I want the member in charge of the bill to give me an answer with regard to a group of offences as to whether they're covered or not. And the first pretty simple question is whether someone who is guilty of fraud is covered by this legislation. And then I'm interested in then is whether someone who has aided and abetted a fraud by being perceived to endorse a contract, whether that person is covered by this legislation if that is convicted. Does someone who is convicted of fraud, or can someone be convicted of fraud for an action which involves a New Zealand company but took place extraterritorially? Is that person covered by this legislation? Would they lose their right to vote? Would their status be changed? And would someone who endorsed a fraud which was committed offshore by a New Zealand company, if that person was a New Zealand citizen, would they be liable under this legislation, if convicted, to